Recording has started. So we have our three wonderful panelists today. I know that we had a fourth, Sabrina Working, your angel, who was listed. She's unfortunately unable to make it. But we do have Tong Zhang, Tracy Parsons, and Jackie Wers. And I'll ask each of you to just briefly introduce yourselves, who you are, and where you currently work. We'll start with you, Jackie.
Hi, my name is Jackie Wers, and I am the Executive Director of Donate Life Northwest, which is a nonprofit that promotes health and saving lives through organ, eye, and tissue donation. I got a PhD in biochemistry way back in the day, and I found that I did not want to smell like dead animals all the time. So I transitioned into academia, spent many years there before moving into the nonprofit sector, and I am excited to be here today. And for those of you who have met me before, you know that I have no filter, so I will answer any question with 1,000% honesty.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Next we have Tracy Parsons.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Parsons. I work at Ocean Conservancy, and we're a national nonprofit conservation organization advocating on behalf of the ocean and ocean-dependent communities. I have been at Ocean Conservancy for the last 7 years, first in the DC area, and about 4 years ago, I moved here to Portland. And as the Director of Conservation Support, I do a lot of developing and facilitating our organization-wide and conservation program, like planning, so strategic planning, annual planning, and then the budgeting systems. So really exciting work, but I love it, actually. And I also do quite a bit of operations work at Ocean Conservancy. So I think I'll pause on the how I got here, because I think that's one of our next questions coming up, but really excited to be here. And thank you so much to Jackie for bringing me to this event, and for Rosemarie for moderating and hosting. I'm excited to be here.
Great, thank you, Tracy. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I echo everything that Tracy just said about thanks for inviting me to this event, and I'm excited to talk to everybody. My name is Tong Zhang. I'm the Executive Director of Oregon Mesa. Mesa is a little bit different from some of the other nonprofits that just were mentioned because we're actually a program that is based at Portland State, but we function very much like a typical nonprofit in the fact that all of our funding has to come through fundraising, and we have to track all of that in the same way that a nonprofit does. It's a program that works with getting underrepresented students engaged in STEM fields. So it's an area that's really near and dear to my heart. My background is in immunology. So I got my PhD in immunology, bachelor's in biochemistry, and I can share a little bit more about how I got here in a little bit. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today.
Of course, thank you, Tom. So yes, as all three of you alluded to, we would love to hear more in detail about your career paths and how specifically you got into the nonprofit sector. So why don't we begin with you, Tracy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have known since I was a very young person that I wanted to do work in the ocean. So I was a marine biology fan from the very early years. And so I went and got a bachelor's of science in biology, and I focused as much of my course study in marine science as possible. And I did a study abroad in the Caribbean, which was awesome. And so I kind of, after working in labs in college, I realized that and also organic chemistry was a big signal that probably lab work, not for me. And so I realized that I also, one of the professors I worked for had 30 years of data about a subtidal zone in Massachusetts. And I asked him what he was doing with that. So, because he was noticing different things die off as development was increasing and things like that. And he said, well, that's not my job. I publish the papers, and there are other people that do that kind of advocacy work. I was like, oh, that's what I want to do then. And so that was what brought me to a science and policy master's degree. And I did a master's in environmental management at Duke University. And proud to say that after 20 years, there are a bunch of universities that have similar very policy science professional degrees out there. And I landed right after grad school at a small policy firm on Capitol Hill. I'm originally from the Maryland area, and so that was kind of easy to find my way there. And I actually did a lot of lobbying. So again, that advocacy, lobbying for conservation work. I worked with tribes in the Pacific Northwest and tried to get funding for salmon restoration. And we had a bunch of different clients. And some of them were doing environmental work, some of them were doing ocean work. And I realized I wanted to get back further into the ocean. And so I saw an opening for a program manager in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in their coral reef conservation program. And so I applied and I landed there doing a lot of strategic planning for that federal program. They're appropriated about $24 million a year, and somebody's got to figure out how to spend that money. And so that's kind of what I did in that job. And we were working a lot with agency scientists. And it was really great to be able to use my background and understanding of what was going on in the ocean to be able to recommend different components of research in support of management. And so that was kind of that niche role there. And then I found out I was really good at planning and process and budgeting. And so I spent about 6 to 8, I think it was 8 years as a budget analyst at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so same agency, as well as the Department of Commerce. And that role is really like being an advocate for ocean funding in federal programs. And so that's what I did there. And I just through that and through sort of the network of people from my career, got a call that Ocean Conservancy was looking for someone who really liked planning and budgeting. And there aren't many of us out there, it turns out. And so I realized it would be great to actually be in a community of advocates, of ocean advocates. And so I've always said people make the place, and that's especially important in work. And so I came over to Ocean Conservancy, like I said, about 7 years ago. And again, it's been great to find something that speaks to my soul. I really identify as an ocean advocate, but also like connects to my skills. So that's how I got here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tracy. Tong, you can go next if you'd like.
Sure. So I feel like I ended up my career definitely in happenstance. So I was I was doing I was doing bench science research and in immunology, and I was just not loving it, not so much because I didn't enjoy the research, but honestly because I didn't feel like the environment that I was in was very fostering of growth. I felt like when I was in academia, it was very much an old boys club. I was based at Hopkins at the time, and amazing science done, amazing community in different areas. However, there was still very much felt like didn't know whether or not this invisible, I was very young at the time, so it was just feeling like there was this invisible hierarchy that I was never going to break through. So I started thinking about okay, maybe I don't want to do this. What else could I do? And I had spent the last at that point, long time, close to probably a decade, doing research and thinking well, I don't have any other skills. I was okay, I could do pipetting. I'm really great at tissue culture. And thinking if I didn't do science, what would I do? And so I started, and I was in Maryland at the time. And so similar to Tracy, and I was in Baltimore, and I applied actually to be a volunteer at 2 organizations. One, I was I love working with kids. So there was an organization there called Thread, and there was another organization, the Maryland Science Center, which was very equivalent to OMSI here. So I put in a volunteer application to both of them, and Thread called me back first, and that's how actually my nonprofit work started. And I got involved in mentoring as a volunteer with some high school students. And so those were students that were not performing to their potential in high school. And it was a wraparound program. And I loved it so much that I just got more and more involved. And at that time, it was still just it was a nonprofit, but it was all volunteer run. So kind of similar to like this one. And I started getting connected to the executive director there, and I started doing some back end work. I was like, I love data, so I was able to analyze kind of a lot of our activity data and things like that. And then when the opportunity for it to transfer into like hiring staff, I basically threw my hat in and I was like, I'd love to do this because I seem to like this, and I think that I could do this for a little while. And that's how I got my first job, was by asking, like, you're looking for a staff member. And I became one of the first staff members at the organization. And, basically during that time, in my time at Thread, I did like everything from doing like credit recovery individually. I remember like doing pull like all-nighters with students doing credit recovery with kids, to like doing legal advocacy, to like creating infrastructure to the program, to pulling in like big donors to like cultivate those relationships, all sorts of different things. And because it was a young nonprofit, and I will say I got burnt out, and I felt like, okay, I needed to make a little bit of, and also by the time that I left the organization, I was like 6 years probably into when I first started. I felt like we grew a lot. We ended up becoming, at this point now, it's like a nationally renowned nonprofit. And we had, by the time that I left, more than a dozen staff members, like full-time staff members. So I transitioned out, and then I moved back home to Oregon and found out about Mesa, and decided to continue I went back into nonprofits, and especially this is, close to my heart in terms of working with underrepresented students, getting them engaged in STEM fields. And yeah, that's how I ended up applying for this position. And it's all been happenstance, I feel like, up until this point. And so I've been at Oregon Mesa for 7 years. So I feel like a lot of times when people talk about imposter syndrome, I've felt imposter syndrome the entire time that I've been doing this, because honestly, most of it is, literally all of it, I've made up along the way. But at this point, I've been making it up for so long that I actually just do this now. So that is my journey.
Rosemary, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Tong. It's really interesting to hear from you and Tracy both about how you started in academia and then took these very interesting, diverse paths into the careers that you have now. And I believe that is the case with Jackie as well.
Yeah, so I was a scientist from the get-go. I'm very, very nerdy. I got a varsity letter in Mathlete, so that is telling you a little bit about why I didn't have a date to prom. I started doing biomedical research when I was a junior in high school, where I started working in fish virology, and then I worked in a variety of labs all the way through my PhD. During my PhD, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. So I developed a neurodegenerative disease and lost the use of my arms and had a physical disability. I had a nervous breakdown and was diagnosed as being bipolar. I had to take a medical leave of absence. My lab shut down while I was on my medical leave of absence. I had to find another lab. And it was just this series of disasters. And so when I finished my PhD, I was feeling so burnt out on the act of wet bench science that I just was really craving something else. So because I took a long time to finish my PhD, during my last year, I spent the entire year asking everybody that I ran across, what do you do? What were you trained to do? What are the most important skills? And what I found was that it doesn't matter what you're trained in, that the core skills of communication and being able to think on your own and creatively problem solve really transcend discipline, and that no matter what you're trained in, you will find a job. So when I finished my PhD, I applied and got 5 job offers in 5 different sectors, including nonprofit, including law, business. There was a a science communication writing job, and then I took the job at Oregon Health and Science University to be an assistant professor in data and information science. So I went from wet bench to being data and information science. I did that for years. I'm super passionate about helping people find their career path, having done that full year of exploration myself and freaking out the entire time. I really wanted to help other people be able to ask those questions and then generate the confidence necessary to explore different things. So I kept working with graduate students over and over again. The graduate school saw that, eventually made me the director of the Career and Professional Development Center, and then made me the assistant dean for graduate students. And during this time, I'm really, really proud to say that I helped many students identify their core skills, develop what they needed to go off and do amazing careers. So when I started the Career and Professional Development Center, 70% of the PhD graduates were going to do a postdoc. And now that number is 40% because so many of them are finding different career paths that aren't in academia. So my former boss actually just told me that stat the other day, and she's like, I kind of feel like you did too good of a job because now there's not enough people for academia. And I'm like, oh, don't worry, academia will be fine. But after years in academia, I was feeling really burnt out. Working with students is tremendously fulfilling, but it was a lot of late nights in the emergency room and midnight phone calls and all sorts of things that eventually I was like, I want to try and use my skills in a different sector. So based off of all of that experience that I had exploring different sectors, I knew I wanted to be something that was highly mission aligned. So I looked in the nonprofit sector because, again, that mission alignment is super important to me. And I eventually became the executive director of Saturday Academy, which is a STEM education nonprofit. Now, to Tong's point, I have no goddamn idea what I'm doing every single day. And this is not just work, it includes like parenting as well. But I became an executive director, and I had never worked in a nonprofit before, but thanks to people like Tong, I was able to learn a lot, and that scientific training of problem solving and really looking for the information to help you solve a problem was instrumental in making that job a success. And then I transitioned to being the executive director of Donate Life Northwest. So it all, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, it's like, oh, look at all of that. It just flows right together. But in reality, it's a whole bunch of, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going on. But overall, I feel super grateful that I have had the support and the really mentorship from so many people to be able to explore this particular sector.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. It's really amazing to hear about how all three of you are in such incredible positions now. And, sounds like at the beginning of your career, this is one of the last things you would have expected. And these paths are so interesting to hear about and so inspiring. So this next question, I think it's about your organization's work culture. And I ask because I feel like when I was going through my education, there was a lot of talk about the culture of industry versus academia, but not a lot of talk of what that would look like in other sectors. So I would love to hear a bit about how your organization's culture differs from your previous academic or other positions that you've held. You could start with Tong.
Yeah, I was going to wait for someone else to chime in, only because the interesting thing about both the organizations I've worked with, Thread and Mesa, is how closely we have been tied to universities. So even though Thread was a standalone nonprofit, we, for the first, up until I think the time that I left, we were intimately tied into Johns Hopkins network. We got donation of space and everything. And so I felt like, and because actually we were a nonprofit entirely pretty much of escapees from science, we all kind of had a little bit of that culture that I feel like I am still sort of calibrating myself and again, being at Mesa, we're based at the College of Engineering, that we're in this kind of in between. So I feel like I've obviously interacted with a lot of other nonprofits, but I think our cultures are still a little bit similar. And I think that what I have experienced, I don't know about in terms of fully industry, but in terms of the environment that I've experienced in nonprofits is that there's a lot of similarities. People are trying to get grants, people are trying to trying to hustle different things. I feel like, especially in terms of like making projects and I don't know, I feel like it's a lot of similarities, but I definitely am interested to hear what Tracy and Jackie have to say.
Well, I think that there's a lot of similarities because it is so mission aligned. It is either you're doing the research for, this pure scientific discovery, or you're fulfilling the mission of your nonprofit organization. And it's real easy for that kind of dedication to a mission to create burnout. So one of the things that I think is really, really important when you're looking at nonprofit sector is this a burn and churn nonprofit, because there are those that will absolutely burn people out. But I also feel that nonprofits are more nimble than academia and more nimble than business. So there's a lot of flexibility, especially as an executive director, to create significant culture change. And so that is something that I really am gravitating towards. I am seeing a lot of change in the nonprofit sector to become really much more strong in the tangible benefits that they're offering their employees. So, time off, paid maternity leave, things that, you don't think of when you think of nonprofit. I think there's a lot of EDs that are working hard to create that environment. And then in terms of the mission alignment, I think it really does really inspire people. So I think that's one great aspect of culture that is really positive and something that I do enjoy. But the burnout, you do have to watch out for.
Plus one to what you both said. I think what I thought about and reflected on before was that there's far more community and passion at Ocean Conservancy than almost all of the places I have ever worked. And I think that that's what a mission-driven organization gets you. And I mean that passion, like, for the folks that are in our finance team, like, they love the ocean too. Like, they're there because they want to work for an organization that, again, like, they might not be up at the hill advocating in front of legislators for policy change around conservation, but they're part of the team and they really feel that way. So, like, the community aspect is really pretty awesome. And then I would also say, just talking to friends who are in the federal government, our organization is definitely doing far more with respect to internal equity and inclusion work. So I think that that's a pretty stark difference. And I mean that because it's not just in the federal government. A lot of times it's like they have structures in place, and they have had structures in place for a long time. But there's actually in our organization, it's on all of us. Like, there's a community around that. There's expectations around that. There's just more of a culture of inclusion that is everyone is involved in, rather than it being something, oh yeah, HR is going to do that kind of thing. So that's kind of what I mean there. But yeah, burnout, it's a tough one. Yeah.
So thank you all for touching on both some of the more positive and negative aspects of the cultures of your respective organizations. I'd like to ask you to expand a little bit on either or the opportunities that excite you the most about your job, as well as some of the obstacles and challenges that you face in your current position and how you've overcome those. Jackie, we can start with you.
So what excites me about my job is that it is something new every day, like every day. And every evening I will run outside and I'll be like, Tracy, you won't believe what happened today. And sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing, but it's always changing. And I think that's one thing that's really exciting about nonprofit work is that, I come right now, my nonprofit is 47 years old. It's actually older than I am. And the programming has actually always been continually evolving. So there's always room for something new to try to meet the mission in a new way. So I think that's something that really excites me about it. And then also the other thing is that it is more nimble than academia. So I'm able to institute changes much more quickly. So right now I'm moving my organization to a 4-day work week. And I am just really thrilled to be able to make that transition and being able to make that decision. I mean, it's so cool. Like I really am so excited about giving work-life balance to my staff. But some of the that's exciting. And then an obstacle in my current position is that there is always something different every day. So every day I have to become an expert in budget, and then I have to become an expert in assessment, and then I have to become an expert in board development, and then people management. And it is something that is always keeping me on my toes. And there are things that I never thought I would learn, like photocopier contracts. This is the bane of executive director existences, and I never thought I would know as much as I do, but I do. So in terms of obstacles, it is something about nonprofit because they're nimble, but it also means that there's a lot of things that always need attention and can be falling apart. So it requires a lot of attention, and it requires a lot of systems thinking, but also detail-oriented work. So finding that balance between systems and detail is kind of like the obstacle that is there constantly, but is also at the same time kind of exciting and fulfilling when you hit the right stride.
Oh,
Go ahead, Tracy.
thank you. I will jump in because mine will be short because I really will plus up what Jackie said with respect to being sort of a Jill of all trades, as it were. Like there are just, it almost doesn't matter what position you're in. Even in we're a pretty large organization. We're 150 now. We'll probably be 200 by the end of the fiscal year, which is the end of June. So we're growing, but like they're just because nonprofits do suffer from what we call a scarcity mindset, meaning like we don't think there's enough money to get the change we want to see in the world. It can be really challenging, and we ask folks to do things that are outside their skill sets, but it's a great opportunity to learn. So I've loved that about my work at Ocean Conservancy, and really, really great that way. But yes, on the burnout, I definitely struggled with that very early on in my time just at Ocean Conservancy. I had little kids. Yeah, wow, it was a lot. But I found some great resources out there. There's literally a book called Happy, Healthy Nonprofits, like talks about burnout and how to manage it well. And then I also have a contemplative practice in place. And so mindfulness really helps me to kind of put things in perspective. So I just offer those. And then of course I have an organization that does not want staff to burn out. And so is open to sort of like individual strategies that help and work that way. But on to the exciting things, the opportunities. Wow. Our organization is all about creating durable policy change for the ocean and ocean dependent communities. And they're doing, like all of our teams are doing amazing stuff. So it's just so much fun to see what years of advocacy can do and pay off, and seeing those wins. Like there's a lot there in the climate space, in ocean plastics. So a lot of really good stuff to come. And throughout all of our work, we're trying to do more of a concerted effort to incorporate ocean justice into our conservation outcomes. And so really like digging into what happens when we get that policy change, who's involved in that policy, and how we do that work well. So we have a really great team doing that work at Ocean Conservancy, and I'm super excited to see how that evolves and how it evolves for, again, the ocean and our ocean dependent communities. Like this is really, really fun work. So.
Yeah, I agree with what Tracy and Jackie were saying in terms of like the opportunities to kind of see where the organization mission gets fulfilled, and also being a generalist. I would say that the opportunities that I have been most excited about in my work, and is that I'm honestly, I'm not just saying this, I'm so much of a better person because of all the people that I've met through working in nonprofits. And it's because I've met so a lot of the work that I do has been the continual thread is like, I've now worked in over a decade of working in education. And so in the education nonprofits and work that I've done, it's talking with like families of students that I work, talking with students, talking with young people who are early staff members, talking with folks who are in elected officials, talking with people who are donors, there's such a breadth of people that I have now interacted with in my life, that I have grown from, that I have just learned. I've been humbled by, because it just, like, I remember the first time that I tried to build a relationship with a school partner, and the school partner told me straight to my face, I don't trust you. I have people coming in all the time, trying to do programs and everything. Like, you're going to be gone and tomorrow, and you're not trying to do this for the long term. And I think about those times a lot, for like, really, and it's hard at the moment when you hear things like that, but I take those moments, and I've, like, one, grown a lot thicker of a skin, but also, like, understand, okay, what are the different walks of life that everybody is coming from? Like, what are the different kind of perspectives that people are bringing to the table? And I think it's made me much more effective in getting people to actually move forward big agendas. And so I'm just really, like, I'm constantly excited by meeting new people. Like, and not saying that this is the case in academia, but, like, if you're working in, like, a department of, like, let's say, biochemistry professors, it's an entire department of biochemistry professors. Like, that's the breadth. But the kinds of people, and maybe similar ages, backgrounds, maybe people went to different schools, but the people that I interact with on a daily basis come from all different parts of the world, all different walks of life. Like, they're just so incredible. And I think that that's the thing that I enjoy the most by far, in terms of doing the work that I do. But I think also the obstacles is that the work that I do is so people oriented, that it's hard when in the nonprofit there is a lot of staff turnover, that you have to keep on building new relationships with people. And I will say that does get draining, like, having to build relationships with new people. It's like, you get an advocate in a position, and then they get a different job. It's like, oh, you built all of this is based on personal relationships. And that does end up being a little challenging. Because at the end of the day, it is still a job. Like, people aren't always going to be tied to that singular organization forever, even if they still care about the mission. But I would say still overall, like, being able to engage with the people that I do on a regular basis is such a gift.
Great. Thank you all. It's really interesting to hear, at least in some of these cases, that in some ways the opportunities and the challenges are two sides of the same coin, and that's unavoidable. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear about how that works in your experiences. And all three of you touched at least a little bit on how exciting it is to see your nonprofit fulfill its mission. So I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit on the ways in which you've seen your nonprofit work make a difference in the community. We can start with Tracy.
Well, that's for us as a national organization. We have a lot of different communities, and so I'm actually I might talk about our community in Florida. We have a Florida conservation program, and the program is only a few years old. I think probably 2 or 3 years old. And it has facilitated in Florida the study of sort of waste management streams and how plastic gets to the ocean. And we call these circularity assessment protocols out of a University of Georgia. Dr. Jenna Jambach and her lab do these studies in different cities around the world. And our team has brought Jenna's team to Florida, and soon Florida will be, pending some more funding, soon Florida will be the most studied in waste management of any state, and with the most number of circularity assessment protocols. And that's super wonky, but I'll tell you what it means. It means that we will have the data and information to go advocate for better recycling and better management of plastics, and getting plastics preventing them really from going in the ocean in the state of Florida. And so I think that's pretty awesome because it's been a couple year effort to really think about how do we do this in a state that, politically it's not really at the forefront of preventing plastics from getting in the ocean. So it's kind of exciting stuff. So that's one small example. Another, just very short and quickly, is the work we've been doing in the Arctic. And we work in partnership and often behind and in support of several indigenous communities in the Arctic. And we have a team that works specifically on indigenous-led conservation. And so again, we are a support and a partner to the folks that are leading in their own communities on conservation in the Arctic. So those are two ways I feel like we've, but there are a lot more. But I feel like Jackie and Tong are going to have way better examples being local. So.
I'm sorry, preventing plastics in the ocean, like the garbage trash island, like making that not happen, that's pretty important. So yeah. Yeah, Tracy's work is really inspiring. And honestly, one of the reasons why I have continued in the nonprofit sector is because of Tong and Tracy and hearing about the work and the impact that both of their organizations do and make. So the Indigenous people's work that Tracy's organization is doing, like that's affecting whole communities. And I think that is so incredible. I used to focus on a little tiny molecule, whether a carbon was here or here, and that was my entire existence. And so now switching into donation, I'm talking about community health. And an example of the impact that we had is that we released a documentary, and it's called A Donation Conversation. And it's all about having the conversation about donation. It's not necessarily saying that you need to sign up to be a donor, but that making sure that your wishes are known or that your general thoughts are known with your family is something that everyone should do, because this is part of your health and well-being. So we released a documentary. It was premiered at the University of Portland, and a student saw the documentary, had a conversation with her parents, and later one of her parents had a stroke and ended up becoming an organ donor. And it was because they had the conversation that the family knew absolutely that organ donation was something that this individual wanted to do. And so that individual was able to donate 2 organs and save 2 lives. And the way that I like to think about this is if you're on dialysis waiting for a kidney, which is something that thousands of Americans are waiting for, every day feels like the worst day of your life because you literally don't have a way to purify your body. So being able to donate a kidney is giving decades of life to individuals. And that is something that is really motivating to me, is because the process of organ donation can truly save lives.
Okay, those 2 are really hard to follow. So I think that what Jackie and Tracy are saying, I think just kind of shows that like the scope of different nonprofit organizations and what we all do. I would say that the work at Mesa is much more personal, but also at a level of in terms of inspiration. So I think that it's more about, the work that we do is we work with like middle and high school students and really getting students who otherwise were not interested in or thought it was possible for them to enter into STEM fields to think like, okay, these are career opportunities that are possible for me. And, it is also an area that is, from a scientific standpoint, hard to study, where it's like, okay, what point did, like, if you do a mass study about like, when students enter into different fields, was the inciting factor. We have done research on some of the longitudinal evaluations to show that Mesa students actually graduate at high school at higher rates than their academically and demographically matched peers, which is huge. And then they do end up in STEM fields and graduate at STEM fields from STEM fields at higher rates than other students who are demographically and academically matched to them, which are huge wins. But I think that the things that always resonate, it's like what Jackie was kind of saying about the personal stories, is when I meet, apparently everyone's been in Mesa. It's a program that's been around for over 50 years nationally, but locally in Oregon's been around for 37 years, which is just slightly younger than me. And then, but it's like been able to impact students like in the area for so long that when I sometimes have to walk into community rooms, I'll be like, oh, I'm working with Oregon Mesa, and random people will be like, oh, I did that in high school. That was so like, that was really crucial for me to, you know, get interested in math, or like, oh, I did that in elementary school and I loved my teacher. And I think being able to hear those stories just show that like the lasting impacts of those kind of mindset changing things. But it isn't quite to the level of like removing plastics from the ocean and saving literal lives, but it's not, in terms of comparison, I think showing like the different kinds of impacts that nonprofits can make.
I know, but you're making all of the next nonprofit leaders and like folks who are going to do all that good stuff. So
yes, we hope. Yes.
No, literally.
So, Rosemary, I'm going to briefly hijack the order of questions because I want to talk a little bit about addressing inequity in your organization. And I just want to say that Oregon Mesa is by far the most impactful STEM nonprofit when it comes to promoting and supporting underrepresented students in the STEM field. And it is phenomenal, the amount of work that they do, the lives that they touch. If you look at their statistics, it is transformative. And these are opportunities that our Black and brown children are not getting. And Oregon Mesa is offering them. So in terms of equity, I think Oregon Mesa is light years ahead of Donate Life Northwest. And the reason why I signed up for this question for Donate Life Northwest is because there is intrinsic systemic racism in healthcare. It is a huge problem, and it manifests itself in donation. So on the Oregon waiting list, there are 60% of them are Black, brown, or Asian. Whereas the population in the United States is under 30% are Black, brown, and Asian. So that disproportion is directly tied to systemic racism. And my organization is pivoting to focus on that. We haven't made that impact yet, but that is where we're heading. And it's organizations like Mesa that are showing me how to do it. So I just wanted to throw that in there and as a plug for Mesa's tremendous impact.
Great, thank you. And yeah, Tom, I'll let you. Okay.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the sentiment that putting that work into equity and inspiring the next generation of scientists and leaders is hugely impactful. All three of you are so incredible in what you and your nonprofits have done. And yes, Jackie has already started on the next question, but I would love to hear from all of you about what your nonprofit is doing to address issues of inequity, either within your organization itself or within the community at large. You can chime in as you wish.
I guess, okay, I will continue. And I think, yeah, I will kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about relationships. I think a lot of the relationships that I have made with people over the years has really highlighted just like, especially in education, which is something that the systemic racism and inequality that exists in education is so deep, that goes all the way from where students end up going to school, the kinds of schools that students go to then what kind of careers that they go through. It's like it touches almost all aspects of our society, but is not talked about in a way that it needs to be. And so what we've been trying to do at Mesa and just with great partners in the community is highlighting the fact that all of these things are interconnected and they go deep. It's so for a long time when I first started at Mesa, and even in my early days when we were here, we were like, oh well, the work that we do is about getting underrepresented students to get involved in STEM, and that's equity, and it is, except what really it's about is going deeper. And it's like, okay, so then what are we as an organization doing? Like there's what we do, but then there's like who we are. Are we doing enough? Are our staff as well trained in all anti-racism and the different aspects that they should be? Our policies, like part of our program is competitions, and because we think it's a really great way to get students like interested and engaged, and then they start feeling proud of their accomplishments. But were our competitions equitable? Do they actually, the winners of our competitions, did they always reflect the greater body of students that participated in the program? And when we started to ask those really hard questions, a lot of the times the answers were like, well, no, we're not actually living out our mission, even though we are still doing generally a good job, but not good enough, and really not good enough in the way that we were dispersing resources. And so I think that the way that we are tackling inequity is like not just thinking of it as an other thing, as thinking first about what we should be like, not just that there's inequity in the world, but in order to tackle the big systemic inequity in the world, we have to first think about what is it that in our own locus of control we can do better. And there's so much more that we can do better in our hiring practices, in the way that we promote people, in the way that we make sure that we are accommodating to disabilities that are visible or invisible, life situations that are visible, invisible, and doing those first, and then thinking about the way that we do things, all the things that we've been doing for a really long time. Have we just been doing them because it was easy to keep on doing those things? Or should we actually change the way? It's really hard to actually change the way that you've been doing things for a really long time. So I think but all of that is really scary. So I feel like the way that Jackie kind of presented us, I'm very humbled by and grateful for, but I feel like it's so much of it is just really, really hard work that I feel like I'm constantly fumbling my way through. It's just like, okay, we're going to make mistakes, but being really transparent with people that we are going to at least try, and we're going to at least try and tell people that, and call it out when it needs to be. It's really saying like, this space is not inclusive enough, and what we are doing is not inclusive enough.
That was really great to hear. And I feel a lot of community around that, Tom, because so Ocean Conservancy is an almost 200-person organization, like we will be by the end of June. And we've been sort of thoughtfully working on internal equity, diversity, and inclusion since 2013. So almost 10 years. And we still have a long way to go. It's like an ongoing and forever journey. We sort of just a lot of what you described. We have a framework of sphere one is our personal sphere of influence. What can we do as individuals? How I raise my kids, what books I read, how I educate myself, things like that. Sphere two is the internal work of Ocean Conservancy. So that's all those human resource policies, pay equity, having communities of support for staff, and that really focused on equity and inclusion. We hold ourselves accountable to our demographics around leadership, board, and overall staff with an organization called Green 2.0, which is really advocating for more racial diversity and gender diversity in the environmental space. So it's pretty great organization and has shown us a lot of leadership about how to be better. And they publish a lot of really great reports in that aspect. And then the third sphere is really like our external work and how we get conservation done and what are our conservation outcomes and are they actually just and equitable. And so we sort of evaluate a lot of our conservation strategy, and our planning incorporates all of that. And then we have our people and culture team that's doing kind of the internal work and leading supervisors and managers and everybody on doing that. And then we really encourage, and we have like a community of just learning where we share resources and encourage folks to like actually read the book. And yeah, so that's what we're doing. But it's a long way to go. And we have publicly held ourselves accountable for past work and past wrongs that we have done. We have an accountability statement and are working on restorative justice for a plastics report we actually published in 2015 that was just wrong. And so that's hard. That is definitely good hard work, but good hard work. So.
One of the things that I remember Tracy telling me about was that she was working on creating a policy about how they chose vendors. And at the time, I hadn't thought about the fact that that is part of the equity conversation as well, making sure that you are choosing to work with vendors that are representative of the community that you're engaging with. And so I took that conversation and I was like, oh, we're going to make a policy for my organization. And there's so many different ways that you can weave in equity and all these conversations into your work with those three spheres, within each of those spheres in so many different ways. And so it's always a journey. It's never an endpoint. It is always something that we need to be actively choosing every day.
Great. Thank you all. It's really exciting to hear not only what each of your organizations is already doing in the equity and inclusion sphere, but as also what goals you have and what new things you're trying to implement and what you have in your near future plans for that. And with that said, I would like to ask, in general, how would you like to see the nonprofit world grow and evolve with regard to equity and inclusion, but also just in general?
Okay, I'll jump in. I think I would like to see, this is pretty niche answer, but I would love to see more nonprofits kind of, and this it comes from a place of privilege, and I know how hard this is to do, but I would really like for us, like the nonprofit world, to demand to be paid for the work that it takes to do. Again, it's that like scarcity mindset, and push funders to actually like support the full body of work and what it really takes to get the work done. And again, I know how hard that is. I do know how. I just finished a proposal yesterday, so like I get it, but I feel like there's a community effort to like set better expectations with funders, to not sort of crimp and save and cut and refine and stuff like that. And I think that would, if we can get funders to understand the art of the possible with true durable investment, I think it would help reduce that scarcity mindset and reduce burnout and have greater impact and all those kinds of things. So I don't know. It's a niche answer, but it's kind of what I thought of when I saw the question.
I so agree with that and think that I would love to see there being a little bit of a different relationships between philanthropy in terms of donors and nonprofits, because philanthropy, for folks that are just like, a lot of them are, say, smaller foundations with lots of money, and a small group of people make the decisions about where they fund. And that's, they're right because they have the money. But I think that especially those who are focused on equitable change and are interested, I think being able to position the relationships between philanthropy and nonprofits differently, where we're doing work together, as opposed to it's like, the scarcity mindset, or like we're begging you to, because here, look how great we are, and then like you deign to give us money. And I think that a lot of organizations, a lot of foundations are doing a really good job in moving in a direction of trust-based philanthropy. But I think that just so much more needs to be done in that regards.
Yeah, ditto to everything that both of them said, because the funding for nonprofits is always unstable ground, and trying to navigate that landscape is always difficult, and trying to navigate that landscape with equity in mind is making it even more difficult. So when it comes to what I would love to see change in the nonprofit sector, it would be how the funding is developed and how it is distributed and how we compete for funding and why we don't collaborate more. So all of that is part of the complexity of nonprofit life. And I would just love to see us spend more time on our mission rather than thinking about the dollars.
this actually ties really well into one of the questions that we got from a registrant, so I'm going to pivot over to that. One of our audience members asked upon registration how you've been able to balance knowing your worth with working in the nonprofit world. So I would love to hear you expand a little bit on your last responses with that in mind.
I'll just share, when I saw that question, I really thought that I think the foundation for knowing that you are equitably paid actually comes down to the organization's equity practices. So, and again, like, we have structures in place. So every job that we post goes through a benchmarking process to ensure that it's at the market rate and it fits into our job structure, and we have transparency around that pay range. And then folks come in and they have an expectation that they are in that pay range somewhere. And when we hire new folks in, we evaluate, does that throw off the equitable pay within the team and within that sort of like pay band and things like that. So we have a lot of structures in place because we're a big organization, right? But if you at least understand that there's a commitment from your executive director or the organization you're interested in working with, that's really, I think, the foundational component, because they can maybe not have all the structures in place, but they value and consider equity to be like an important component, and that will translate to their pay practices. So if they value equity as an institution and they put that out there, and that's something that they talk about, you can have more trust that there are equitable pay practices in place, even at small organizations. So that's my thought.
Okay, so I am about to get on a soapbox here, so bear with me. We as scientists are so laser focused in on our scientific question that sometimes it feels like, as Tong mentioned earlier, the only thing we can do is pipette and figure out if the carbon is here or if the carbon is there. But in reality, the transferable skills that you develop as a scientist are truly fantastic when it comes to being able to think analytically, to surf data, to communicate effectively to a variety of audiences, to be persuasive when you're writing grants, to write grants, to run a project, to run a budget, to understand how to do all of these things all at the same time while you have 16 papers to read, a seminar to give, and a poster to present. That is a scientist. All you need to do is recognize that these skills are transferable into the nonprofit sector. It boils down to being able to do a little bit of code switching and being able to translate the fact that grants management is project management. And what I really, really recommend is do informational interviews. Reach out to people that have made that nonprofit to a transition from science, like any of us on this panel, and have an informational interview. And we can talk to you about how your skills are directly applicable to the nonprofit sector. And you'll find that there are plenty of opportunities and that you are worth amazing things in this sector outside of academia. Off soapbox.
Thank you so much, both of you. Any other thoughts on that, or should we move on to the next? All right, so I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction now. We're coming out, COVID is still very real. We're now at the tail end of what has been a very long pandemic. Things are starting to get a little bit back to normal, but I think it'd be very interesting and informative to hear how the COVID pandemic has impacted your organization's work and how you navigated the last couple of years in your positions.
I will share that we planned our first ever, maybe not ever, but at least in my tenure, large fundraising event gala to happen on March 12th, 2020. So we had to cancel it on March 11th, 2020. And since that point, not as much anymore, but at least for the first year or two, I remember in like later March, early April, we were talking with other staff, and we were just like, what do we do? Our entire organization, we just host events, and what do we do now? And we realized that, we had to completely pivot. And in year like 1, we just like completely remade everything that we did. We still ended up doing the same things mission wise, but the way we did things was fundamentally different. And then year 2, we like, kind of met somewhere in the middle. And I feel like where we're at now is it's a really exciting but scary place where it's like, okay, now we are in a remade world and we don't necessarily want to go back to the way that things were. Like things were running and churning like actually pretty well pre-pandemic for us. And we've had that. We don't want to automatically just go back to that point, because then we wouldn't have not applied any of the lessons that we've had the last few years. And we did learn a lot last few years in terms of being equitable practices, in terms of actually new strategies for growth and new strategies for doing lots of things. And so now we're at a point of trying to actually kind of marry the lessons of what we've done. So one example is like next in a couple of weeks, we're going to do a family career night that is also a hybrid event. And so we're going to try, like, how do we do like both an in-person event while a portion of it will be live stream. I'll report back on how successful it is, but it's something we're like, okay, we want to be able to get back to doing it in person and being able to build that community that we've been missing, but we also want to like not sacrifice all this great visibility that we've had in the last few years. Like being able to do events like this, like virtually, can reach a lot more people. And so that is, yeah, it's kind of it's like I said, really, really exciting in a lot of ways to do additional problem solving, but also really scary because it's once I thought, like I said, I thought I was like kind of knowing how to do my job. And now I feel like I'm having to completely do new things again, which is great, but scary.
So with you, I feel like you just summarized exactly where we are, going back to some in person, but not all in person. And then when do we do that? And yeah, it's really hard, but we're totally with you.
So my nonprofit at the time was predicated on hands-on experiential learning. So to shut all that off was ruinous to the organization. We went in the hole $280,000 in year 1 of COVID. And we had to completely rethink and innovate and come up with something new. And we thought, oh, let's just move it online. But that wasn't enough. We needed to reteach and pedagogy and how to do engagement. And it worked. And so we managed in year 2 to pull out of that budget deficit entirely. So I think that it was a lot of just being adaptable. And that was something that was challenging. It was terrifying. But ultimately, like, I am really glad that I know that I can make a pivot like that now in my professional life and with a whole organization. So to me, that is a hard learned lesson that I'm really, really proud to have gone through in some respects.
Thank you. Yeah, I will say the adaptability component that was important. That was a lot to go through. I know that WIS in particular as well had to fundamentally change a lot of what we were doing, and coming out the other side has been interesting to see the way that we want to keep things different now. All right, so it is 7:07. At 7:15, we're going to want to transition to a Q&A with the audience. So I'm going to combine these last 2 questions before we get there. So first of all, what advice would you have for those who are currently in industry or academia who are interested in transitioning into a nonprofit career? And also for those who are even earlier in their journey, say in high school, this was a user question or a participant question. How can someone who is in high school or an undergrad explore the nonprofit sector on their journey?
I think one thing I will kind of hope to demystify for people is I think we were talking a lot in this conversation about, nonprofit versus academia or things. Nonprofit, it's not a job. It's just it's just literally how the company is incorporated. It's just like any other company. Like you can work in a small company, and it's just like there are small companies, there are big companies, there are, and I think that Jackie was saying there's so many skills that you work in academia and you can translate to nonprofits. Like there are so many different kinds of nonprofits. There are arts nonprofits, there are advocacy nonprofits, there's so many different, there's associations, I think anybody can work in a nonprofit, and just like you can go, but I think it's really important to just go where your passion is. Like, what is it that you're really interested in doing? And then see, like, are there nonprofits that are close to you? You can volunteer for them. People are always, a lot of nonprofits are looking for people with technical expertise to join their boards. And that could be even like when you're young or when you're older, people want to, have constituent voice in organizations. So I think at least that was for me. It was when I was thinking about nonprofits that I used to think, oh, what does that all mean and everything? It's just literally, it's a not-for-profit organization. It's a company that is not meant for profit. It's still a company. It's any other. It's like, even though we've been talking a lot about the differences, like a lot of companies exist, a lot of private agencies exist, and they do run similarly. It's just that in nonprofits, it's an incorporation where we are not to the benefit of. We're not doing this for the benefit of of shareholders. We're doing this for the benefit of the community and for our mission.
I will plus one all of that. It's about passion, is my opinion, in terms of like transitioning into a nonprofit career. Like, follow your passion, because you'll need it. And that's kind of the community you're joining, are folks who are really passionate about the work. And I think one of the things that was most surprising going into the nonprofit world was I came from the federal government, and so I expected there was a lot more infrastructure, like organizational infrastructure in place. And even because I was coming into like a nearly 100-person organization at the time, and there wasn't. And so I ended up doing figuring out a lot, which again is something I really enjoyed. So it was not all bad, but lots of challenges. So organizational infrastructure is a big one. Were we combining the two questions? I think. Yeah. Okay. I will share that in the environmental field, I think that there are a lot of community events, like beach cleanups in my sector, but a lot of just working on trails and things like that. Like, those are great ways for high school students to get involved. And I think a lot of high schools tend to have sort of like environmental clubs and things like that. Like, make sure folks put that on their resume if they're involved in anything at a volunteer level. I will share that Ocean Conservancy, we're looking at doing standing up a high school intern program, but we believe, I know Jackie's excited, we believe that all of the only volunteers that are unpaid are the folks that go to their community beach and help do cleanups. So otherwise, if we have someone working in the organization, like in a staff level or in the office, like we believe in paid internships entirely. And so it is actually a little bit more challenging, I think, for high school students, but we believe that equity is more important. And so we don't tend to have unpaid interns. That said, we did start up a post-college fellowship. It's called the Roger Arlen or Young Marine Conservation Diversity Fellowship. And that is one fellowship that we work, that's now run. We transitioned it over to the Environmental Leadership Program, but they're a great organization in our space. And so that's one that we regularly host fellows for 2 years post undergrad. We also have a couple other fellowships, but and internships, but they're all always on our website. So where jobs are, like, that's the spot. But yeah, I hope that more organizations are going towards like fully paid internships, fellowships, because that's how it should be. And so, yeah, so those are a couple of ideas, but I think any opportunity to get out there and do the science, whether in a lab or otherwise, always translates to the environmental field very, very well.
So I have 1 minute. So my advice to get into transitioning into nonprofits is number one, informational interviews. Go find somebody that works in a nonprofit, have a cup of coffee and just have a conversation. And that is going to be how you're going to learn more about what nonprofit life is really like. So I highly, highly encourage an informational interview. Number two, volunteer. You can volunteer with almost any organization. As Tong mentioned, just as specific as a PhD can get in studying medieval history between this 1 year and this one person for just 6 months, like the same nonprofit exists as well. So you can find a nonprofit that fits your fancy. So volunteer, and then consider like being a leader by being on a board or being on an advisory board or an advisory committee. So these have varying levels of involvement, but again, it's a great way to learn more. So just go forth and be willing to put yourself out there in a position to learn. And I think that you'll find, and this gets to the second part of the question, what was most surprising to me was the fact that everybody that I've encountered in nonprofit land has been so open and collaborative. And in biochemistry, like I collaborated with my team. We had competitors. We did not talk with them. We did this specific area. I did collaborate with people in different fields. But what surprised me the most in nonprofit land is that I've met nonprofit directors and learned from them in all different sectors, whether that's arts, science, performing, whatever, like trail maintenance, associations, all of it. And that's what has been the most gratifying thing about my transition to nonprofit life, is just seeing the incredible diversity of passion that is out there in every little niche possible. So what's most surprising about that to me was just how open and welcoming everybody is.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to move on to the confidential Q&A session with our panelists, which means I'm going to stop the recording in 3, 2, 1. Okay. We are no longer